Before there was punk, there was a sound, a raw, howling noise that erupted from the heart of a city on fire. It wasn't the peace and love folk of California or the polished pop of swinging London. This was something else, something louder, faster, and angrier. It was the sound of pistons and protest, of factory grit and primal fury. And at the center of that sonic hurricane was a voice that didn't just sing lyrics, it hurled them like grenades. The man with that voice was a visual manifesto, a towering afro that became his crown, dark sunglasses that masked his eyes but not his intensity, and a stage presence that was part street preacher, part revolutionary shaman. He was the frontman for a band called the MC5, the Motor City 5, and for a few brief, glorious years, he was the embodiment of rock and roll rebellion. His name was Rob Tyner. He was there at the very beginning, a ground zero architect of the sound that would change music forever. So why is it that when we talk about the godfathers of punk, his name is so often whispered while others are shouted? Why did this titan, this icon of righteous fury, seem to simply vanish, only to be remembered by the most devoted of rock historians? This is the story of a man who screamed for a revolution, a man who kicked out the jams, and then spent the rest of his life living in the quiet aftermath. To understand the lightning in a bottle that was the MC5, you have to understand the city that forged them, Detroit, Michigan, in the mid-1960s. This wasn't just any American city. This was the Motor City, the undisputed engine of American industry. It was a place of hard work, hard living, and a palpable blue-collar energy. The air hummed with the sound of assembly lines and the promise of a steady union job. And it was, of course, the home of Motown Records, whose slick, soulful productions were the smoothest sound in the country. But beneath that surface of industrial might and pop perfection, something else was simmering. Detroit was a city of deep racial and social divides, a pressure cooker of tension. The smooth sounds of the Supremes and the Temptations didn't tell the whole story. By the mid-60s, a younger, whiter generation was absorbing different influences. The raw garage rock of bands like the Kingsmen, the high-energy R&B of James Brown, and the free-form sonic explorations of jazz iconoclasts like Sun Ra and John Coltrane. They were looking for a sound that reflected the grit, the noise, and the growing unrest of their world. In July of 1967, that pressure cooker exploded. The Detroit riot was one of the most violent and destructive civil disturbances in American history. For 5 days, the city burned. When the smoke cleared, 43 people were dead, thousands were injured, and a deep scar was torn into the city's psyche. For the young musicians of the MC5, this was not a news story. This was their backyard. The event radicalized them, convincing them that the old ways were broken and that a total revolution, cultural, political, and musical, was the only answer. They weren't just a rock band anymore. They were a soundtrack for the uprising. The man who would become the voice of that uprising was born Robert Derminer on December 12, 1944, in Detroit. He grew up in the nearby suburb of Lincoln Park, a working-class kid with a restless spirit and an omnivorous taste in music. He wasn't just a rock and roller, he was a deep-cut aficionado. He loved the blues, soul, and especially avant-garde jazz. This musical depth is often overlooked. In a move that signaled his artistic intentions, he would later change his surname to Tyner, a direct homage to the brilliant and innovative jazz pianist McCoy Tyner, who played with the legendary John Coltrane. This wasn't a random choice, it was a statement. He was aligning himself with boundary-pushing, spiritual, and powerful music. In 1964 at Lincoln Park High School, Tyner's path crossed with a fiery, talented guitarist named Wayne Kramer, along with another guitarist, Fred Sonic Smith, bassist Michael Davis, and drummer Dennis Thompson. They formed the nucleus of what would become the MC5. In the beginning, they were a high-energy but relatively conventional cover band, but as the world around them grew more chaotic, so did their music. They started playing faster, louder, pushing their amplifiers to the point of feedback and letting Tyner's raw, powerful voice run wild. Their transformation from a local garage band to a revolutionary force came when they met John Sinclair. Sinclair was a poet, a political activist, and a counterculture visionary who saw in the MC5 something more than just a band. He saw a weapon. He became their manager, but also their political mentor and chief propagandist. He established the White Panther Party, a radical anti-racist political collective of white people working in solidarity with the Black Panthers. Their platform was a total assault on the culture by any means necessary, including rock and roll, dope, and fucking in the streets. The MC5 became the party's official house band, and Rob Tyner, its minister of culture. Their home base was the legendary Grande Ballroom in Detroit, a psychedelic palace where they shared bills with everyone from Cream to Janis Joplin. It was here they honed their infamous live show. It was a spectacle of pure, unadulterated energy. Guitars were wielded like weapons. Drums were pounded into submission, and at the center of it all was Tyner. He wasn't just a singer, he was a conductor of chaos. He'd gyrate, leap, drop to his knees, his voice a primal roar that could cut through the wall of sound created by his bandmates. He was channeling the fury and the hope of his generation. Wayne Kramer later described Tyner's role perfectly. Rob was the shaman. He was the one who could go into the trance and bring the audience with him. The band's local legend status exploded onto the national stage in August of 1968. While the Democratic National Convention was taking place inside a guarded hall in Chicago, a massive anti-war protest, the Festival of Life, was organized in nearby Lincoln Park. The MC5 were the only band with the guts to show up and play. As helicopters buzzed overhead and riot police amassed, the MC5 took the stage and launched into their set. It was a moment of pure defiance. In the face of state power, they answered with amplified noise. This performance cemented their reputation as the most politically radical band in America. Their record deal with Elektra Records, home of the Doors, followed soon after. The label wanted to capture the legendary energy of their live shows, so they decided to record the band's debut album live at the Grande Ballroom over 2 nights in October 1968. The result was Kick Out the Jams, one of the most explosive and influential debut albums in rock history. The record was a sonic assault, a document of a band at the peak of its power. And it all started with Rob Tyner's iconic rabble-rousing introduction, which served as both a mission statement and a battle cry. And right now, it's time to kick out the jams, motherfucker. That single word, motherfucker, would come to define their career for better and for worse. In 1969, it was an unthinkable profanity to include on a major label album. It was a direct challenge to the establishment, the censors, and the corporate world. And the corporate world fought back. The album was banned by radio stations. The Hudson's department store chain, a Michigan institution, refused to stock the album, calling it obscene. In response, the band took out a full-page ad in a local underground paper that read, "Fuck Hudson's," complete with the Elektra Records logo. That was the last straw. Elektra, terrified of the controversy, dropped the MC5 from the label just a few months after their debut was released. They were now notorious but also industry pariahs. The story of Rob Tyner is inextricably linked to the story of the band, but it's important to understand his unique position within it. While Kramer and Smith were the primary musical architects, Tyner was the soul and the face of the MC5. He was the one who had to physically embody revolutionary rhetoric every single night. And as the initial utopian dreams of the 60s counterculture began to curdle, that weight became heavier and heavier. After being dropped by Elektra, they were picked up by Atlantic Records. Their manager, John Sinclair, was sentenced to 10 years in prison for giving 2 joints to an undercover narcotics officer. A shockingly harsh sentence that became a cause célèbre, sparking the Free John movement. Without Sinclair's ideological guidance, the band was somewhat adrift. For their second album, 1970s Back in the USA, they worked with producer John Landau, who would later go on to manage Bruce Springsteen. Landau stripped away the chaotic, live-in-your-face sound of the debut and replaced it with a cleaner, more focused, and radio-friendly production. The album contained tight 3-minute rock and roll anthems. It was, in many ways, a blueprint for the punk rock sound that would emerge years later. But for many of their original fans, it felt like a betrayal, a retreat from the raw power of their first album. Rob's performance on that album is different, more constrained. The primal shaman is replaced by a rock and roll shouter. It's still powerful, but the wild, untamed spirit feels tamed. The album, despite containing some of their best songs, was a commercial failure. Their third and final album, 1971's High Time, saw the band return to a heavier, more expansive sound, and it featured Tyner's most nuanced and mature vocal performances. It was a brilliant record, but it was too late. The momentum was gone. The band was fractured by drug use, financial problems, and a growing sense of disillusionment. The revolution they had screamed for hadn't arrived. They had kicked out the jams, but the world just kept on spinning. In 1972, the MC5 quietly dissolved. For Rob Tyner, the end of the band was the beginning of a long, quiet journey away from the spotlight. This is the part of his story that is so often forgotten, and it's where we find the true measure of the man. What does a revolutionary do when the war is over? How does a shaman find his place in the mundane world? Rob moved away from the chaos. For a time, he and his wife Becky and their children lived on a farm in Iowa. The man who once preached a total assault on the culture was now living a life of rural quiet. He worked a series of regular jobs. He was a painter, a handyman. He even worked in a record store. Imagine that. The voice of one of the most legendary albums of all time, selling records to teenagers who likely had no idea who he was. This wasn't a story of bitter failure, but one of quiet dignity. He never stopped making music. He formed new bands like the new MC5 and later Rob Tyner and the Rob Tyner Band, which played a mix of blues, rock, and soul. They played small clubs, not stadiums. He released a few singles and an album called Blood Brothers. The music was good, filled with heart and grit, but it never captured the zeitgeist like his early work. There's a poignant, rarely discussed interview from this period where he reflected on his past. He wasn't bitter, but he was clear-eyed about the toll his revolutionary past had taken. He said, "I didn't want my whole life to be an anticlimax." This single sentence reveals so much about his internal world. He was proud of the MC5, but he refused to be defined solely by those few chaotic years. He was trying to build a new life, to be a husband, a father, and an artist on his own terms, away from the myth. He found a sense of peace and purpose in this new, quieter life. Wayne Kramer recalled visiting him during this time and finding a man who was content, who loved his family, and who was at ease with himself, far from the pressures of the music industry. The central controversy surrounding the MC5 has always been about their politics. Were they a genuine political entity, or just a great rock and roll band that got caught up in John Sinclair's revolutionary fervor? The truth, as it often is, lies somewhere in the middle. The band members themselves had differing views. Wayne Kramer was a committed political activist. Other members were perhaps more interested in the rock and roll dope and fucking in the streets part of the platform. Rob Tyner seems to have existed at the intersection of these two impulses. He was a true believer in the power of music to change consciousness, but he was also a showman, a performer who loved the raw energy of rock and roll. The political rhetoric gave their music a sense of urgency and importance that set them apart from every other band of their era. But that same rhetoric made them dangerous to the establishment and ultimately limited their commercial appeal. They were too radical for the mainstream, and when they tried to clean up their sound on Back in the USA, they were seen as sellouts by a portion of their original hardcore audience. They were caught in a trap of their own making. Another historical debate revolves around their actual influence. While they are now almost universally cited as proto-punk pioneers, for decades they were little more than a cult band. They never had a gold album or a top 40 hit. Their flame burned incredibly bright, but also incredibly fast. Unlike their Detroit contemporary Iggy Pop, who was rescued from obscurity by David Bowie in the mid-70s, the MC5 had no such high-profile champion to reintroduce them to a new generation. They were a historical artifact, a symbol of 60s radicalism that seemed out of place in the slick disco-drenched 70s and the corporate rock of the 80s. For years, Rob Tyner was a ghost, a forgotten legend living a normal life in the suburbs. The historical significance of Rob Tyner and the MC5 cannot be measured in record sales. Their importance is found in the DNA of virtually every punk, hard rock, and alternative band that followed, from the Ramones and the Clash in the 70s to Soundgarden and Rage Against the Machine. In the 90s, their influence is undeniable. They proved that rock music could be more than just entertainment. It could be a vehicle for dissent, a political tool, a weapon of cultural change. They were one of the first bands to be actively targeted by the U.S. government. The FBI had a thick file on them, monitoring their activities and seeing them as a genuine threat to national security. They paid a real price for their beliefs, sacrificing mainstream success and financial stability for their art and their politics. Rob Tyner's personal legacy is that of the ultimate proto-punk frontman. He set the template, the wild hair, the confrontational stage presence, the voice that blurred the line between singing and screaming. It all starts with him. He was raw power personified. But his story also serves as a crucial lesson about what happens after the revolution fails or simply fades away. He showed that it was possible to walk away from the wreckage of rock and roll stardom with your dignity and humanity intact. He chose family and a quiet life over a desperate, unending chase for his former glory. There is a profound strength in that choice. His journey from the riot-torn streets of Detroit to a quiet life as a painter and family man is a testament to his resilience. In the late 1980s and early 90s, there was a renewed interest in the MC5. A new generation of musicians was discovering their records, and the world was finally catching up to what they had been doing 2 decades earlier. There was talk of a proper reunion, but it was not to be. On September 17, 1991, Rob Tyner was at home in Berkeley, Michigan. He had been working on his car in the driveway when he felt unwell. He went inside, and shortly after, his heart gave out. A massive heart attack took his life. He was just 46 years old. His death wasn't a typical rock and roll cliche of overdose or suicide. It was a tragically mundane end for a man who had lived such an extraordinary life. Rob Tyner's story is one of incredible sound and ultimately a long, undeserved silence. He was a man who stood at the epicenter of a cultural explosion, a voice that roared with the conviction of a generation that truly believed it could change the world with 3 chords and the truth. He was a pioneer who drew the map that countless others would follow, often without ever knowing his name. But to remember him only for the noise would be to miss the point. We should also remember the quiet. Remember the man who chose to step away, to raise a family, to find peace not on a stadium stage, but in his own backyard. His life is a powerful, poignant reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary act is not to burn out, but to find a way to keep your own small flame burning long after the great fire has faded. He was Robert Derminer, Rob Tyner, the shaman of the Motor City. And if you listen closely, past the feedback and the fury, you can still hear his voice calling on us all these years later to kick out the jams, whatever they may be. And that's all for today's video. If you liked this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.